The Endurance, by Caroline Alexander. This book consists of 9 chapters and is 210 pages long. The following material appears on the dust jacket of the book. In August 1914, days before the outbreak of the First World War, the renowned explorer Ernest Shackleton and a crew of 27 set sail for the South Atlantic in pursuit of the last unclaimed prize in the history of exploration, the first crossing on foot of the Antarctic continent. Weaving a treacherous path through the freezing Weddell Sea, they had come within 85 miles of their destination when their ship, Endurance, was trapped fast in the ice pack. Soon the ship was crushed like matchwood, leaving the crew stranded on the floes. Their ordeal would last 20 months, and they would make 2 near-fatal attempts to escape by open boat before their final rescue. Drawing upon previously unavailable sources, Caroline Alexander gives us a riveting account of Shackleton's expedition, one of history's greatest epics of survival, and she presents the astonishing work of Frank Hurley, the Australian photographer whose visual record of the adventure has never before been published comprehensively. Together, text and image recreate the terrible beauty of Antarctica, the awful destruction of the ship, and the crew's heroic daily struggle to stay alive, a miracle achieved largely through Shackleton's inspiring leadership. The survival of Hurley's remarkable images is scarcely less miraculous. The original glass plate negatives, from which most of the book's illustrations are superbly reproduced, were stored in hermetically sealed canisters that survived months on the ice floes, a week in an open boat on the polar seas, and several more months buried in the snows of a rocky outcrop called Elephant Island. Finally, Hurley was forced to abandon his professional equipment. He captured some of the most unforgettable images of the struggle with a pocket camera and 3 rolls of Kodak film. Published in conjunction with the American Museum of Natural History's landmark exhibition on Shackleton's journey, The Endurance thrillingly recounts one of the last great adventures of the heroic age of exploration, perhaps the greatest of them all. Caroline Alexander has written for The New Yorker, Granta, Condé Nast Traveler, Smithsonian, Outside, and National Geographic, and is the author of 4 previous books. She is the curator of Endurance, Shackleton's legendary expedition, an exhibition that will open at the American Museum of Natural History in March 1999. She lives on a farm in New Hampshire. The Endurance, Shackleton's legendary Antarctic expedition, by Caroline Alexander. Never for me the lowered banner, never the last endeavour. Sir Ernest Shackleton. The heroic age. The captain of the ship, Frank Worsley, would remember the day vividly ever afterward. It was July, midwinter in Antarctica, and the darkness of the long polar night had been upon them for many weeks. The temperature was minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and around the ship, extending to the horizon in all directions, was a sea of ice, white and mysterious under the clear, hard stars. From time to time, the shriek of the wind outside broke all conversation. Away in the distance the ice would groan, and Worsley and his 2 companions would listen to its ominous voice as it travelled to them across the frozen miles. Sometimes the little ship would quiver and groan in response, her wooden timbers straining as the pressure from millions of tons of ice, set in motion by some faraway disturbance, at last reached her resting place, and nipped at her resilient sides. One of the 3 men spoke. "She's pretty near her end. The ship can't live with this, skipper. You'd better make up your mind that it's only a matter of time. It may be a few months, and it may only be a question of weeks or even days. But what the ice gets, the ice keeps." The year was 1915. The speaker was Sir Ernest Shackleton, one of the most renowned polar explorers of his day, and the 3rd man was Frank Wild, his second in command. Their ship, Endurance, was trapped at latitude 74 degrees south, deep in the frozen waters of Antarctica's Weddell Sea. Shackleton had been intent on an ambitious mission. He and his men had travelled to the south to claim one of the last remaining prizes in exploration, the crossing on foot of the Antarctic continent. Since December 1914, the Endurance had battled unusually heavy ice conditions, travelling more than 1,000 miles from the remote whaling station on the island of South Georgia, at the gateway to the Antarctic Circle. 100 miles short of the intended harbour, new ice conditions brought the Endurance to a halt. A northeast gale, blowing on and off for 6 straight days, compressed the pack against the Antarctic ice shelf, trapping the ship fast within it. Days later the temperature plummeted to 9 degrees, as good as cementing the loose pack for the winter. Meanwhile, the leisurely, unrelenting northerly drift of the Weddell Sea carried the Endurance within the pack farther and farther from the land it had come so close to reaching. When Shackleton embarked upon his Imperial Transantarctic expedition, he was already a national hero, with 2 polar expeditions behind him, including one that had taken him to within 100 miles of the South Pole, the farthest south anyone had travelled at that time. Yet for all the heroism of these earlier efforts, neither had accomplished what it had set out to do. By the time Shackleton headed south again, in 1914, the prize of the South Pole, which he had twice sought, had been claimed by others. Undaunted, he had turned his sights upon a last great venture, the crossing of the Antarctic continent from the Weddell to the Ross Sea. The preparations for the Endurance expedition had been all-consuming. Not the least of Shackleton's tasks had been raising the funds to make it possible. He was 40 years of age, and he had summoned all his experience as explorer and organizer to bear on this ambitious undertaking. Shackleton could not yet know it, but the Transantarctic expedition would amount to another unsuccessful venture. Yet ultimately it would be for this, the failed Endurance expedition, that he would be most remembered. Antarctic exploration of the early 20th century was unlike exploration of anywhere else on Earth. No dangerous beasts or savage natives barred the pioneering explorer's way. Here, with wind speeds up to nearly 200 miles an hour and temperatures as extreme as minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit, the essential competitions were pure and uncomplicated, being between man and the unfettered force of raw nature, and man and the limits of his own endurance. Antarctica was also unique in being a place that was genuinely discovered by its explorers. No indigenous peoples had been living there all along, and the men who set foot on the continent during this age could authentically claim to have been where no member of humankind had ever cast a shadow. Beginning in 1914 and ending in 1917, straddling the First World War, the Endurance expedition is often said to have been the last of the heroic age of polar exploration. The significance and ambition of Shackleton's proposed transantarctic crossing is best appreciated within a context of the ordeals of heroism and egotism that had played out before. Indeed, Shackleton's greatness as a leader on the Endurance owes much to the sometimes insane suffering of his earlier Antarctic experiences. The heroic age began when the ship Discovery, under the command of Captain Robert Falcon Scott, set out for Antarctica's McMurdo Sound in August 1901. Despite public talk of scientific advancement, the real objective of this first inland expedition, as of subsequent ones, was to reach the as yet unclaimed South Pole and win it for Britain. Scott chose 2 men to accompany him on this first bid for the pole, Dr. Edward Wilson, a physician, zoologist, and close friend, and Lieutenant Ernest Shackleton, a 28-year-old merchant service officer whose commissions had taken him to Africa and the East. On November 2nd, the 3 men set out with 19 sledging dogs and 5 loaded sledges. They faced an unspeakably daunting challenge, a round-trip journey of more than 1,600 miles, hard sledging all the way, through an entirely unknown and uncharted environment. By day, the 3 man-hauled their loads, with or without the aid of the dogs, ferrying their supplies in time-consuming relays. By night, they meticulously divided their meagre food into 3 equal portions and read Darwin to one another before retiring to their frozen sleeping bags. They starved, they suffered from scurvy. The dogs sickened and dropped, and were butchered to feed the survivors. Scott pushed his band on to 82 degrees 17 minutes south, 745 miles north of the pole, before acknowledging their desperate situation and reluctantly giving the order to turn back. By this time Shackleton was spitting blood, undone by scurvy, and sometimes had to be carried on the sledge. On February 3rd, 1903, 3 months after setting out, they arrived back at their ship. The last leg of this terrible journey had been a race for their very lives. This first Antarctic trek established the pattern of heroic suffering that would characterize subsequent British expeditions. Yet even a casual perusal of the explorers' diaries suggests this suffering was unnecessary. Less than 3 weeks into their journey, Wilson notes, "Dogs getting very tired and very slow." 19th November. "The dogs made terrible heavy weather of it today, and the dog driving has become the most exasperating work." 21st November. "Dogs very weary indeed and terribly slack, and the driving of them has become a perfectly beastly business." 24th of November. Day after day one follows the downward spiral of these wretched, exhausted animals. It is unpleasant reading. Scott's own diary sounds more alarms. "On the whole, our skis so far have been of little value. The dogs, which have now become only a hindrance, were hitched on behind the sledges. Scott wrote on January 6, 1903. The following day he notes that they dropped all the dogs out of the traces and pulled steadily ourselves for 7 hours, covering 10 good miles by sledge meter. The animals walked pretty steadily alongside the sledges. It is a stunningly improbable image. 3 men walking across Antarctica at about a mile an hour with their skis securely strapped to the sledges, accompanied by a pack of dogs. Scott and his companions had not taken the time to become proficient on skis, nor did they have any knowledge of driving dogs. Their prodigious difficulties, therefore, were the result of almost inconceivable incompetence, not necessity. And the men were starving, not because unforeseen disaster had taken their supplies, but because they had not rationed sufficient food. Shackleton, the biggest of the men, suffered the most because he required more fuel than did the others. And they had quarrelled. Scott and Shackleton could not have been temperamentally more dissimilar, and had virtually no rapport. As a product of the Navy, Scott established a rigid order predicated upon rank and rules. On the Discovery, in the middle of the Antarctic, he put a man in irons for disobedience. Shackleton, an Anglo-Irishman from the ranks of the merchant marine, was charismatic, mixing easily with both crew and officers. He had been chosen to accompany Scott on account of his physical strength. The long days of white silence, the unrelenting tedium and hardship, the unrelieved close quarters, all these factors must have shredded the men's nerves. Wilson appears to have been forced to act as peacemaker on more than one occasion. Years later, Scott's second-in-command told the story that after breakfast one day Scott had called to the other men, "Come here, you bloody fools." Wilson asked if he was speaking to him, and Scott replied no. "Then it must have been me," said Shackleton. "Right, you're the worst bloody fool of the lot, and every time you dare to speak to me like that, you'll get it back." It is a surreal encounter, a piece of absurd theatre. 3 men, alone at the ends of the earth, in a virtual whiteout, hissing at one another. On their return to the Discovery, Scott invalided Shackleton home. Though mortified by his early return to England, Shackleton arrived home as a hero who had gone farther south than anyone before, and as the lone available authority on the expedition, he received more attention than would otherwise have been the case. This recognition, he must have known, would prove valuable, should he one day wish to stage his own expedition. In any case, he would never again submit to the leadership of another man. The son of a physician, Shackleton was comfortably middle class. Born in County Kildare, Ireland, he had lived briefly in Dublin as a child before his parents moved their family permanently to England. He was the eldest of 2 sons and had 8 doting sisters. Shackleton had been educated at Dulwich College, a middle-class public school of high reputation, before joining the British Merchant Navy at age 16. Prior to volunteering for the National Antarctic Expedition under Captain Scott, he had been a 3rd officer with a prestigious merchant service line. Charming and handsome, with dark, brooding looks, Shackleton was a man of romantic ambitions, and in later life would fall under the spell of many a fruitless fortune-making scheme. Polar exploration appealed to both his poetical nature and his urgent aspiration to secure a position in the class-riven world of his time. The Discovery expedition had opened the door onto a more glamorous and congenial life. It was a way out of the middle class. In 1904, Shackleton married his patient sweetheart, Emily Dorman, who, as the daughter of a well-to-do lawyer, was of modestly independent means. Now more than ever he wanted to establish a name for himself. When ventures into journalism, business, and even politics failed, Shackleton moved towards his ultimate destiny. In early 1907 he obtained seed money for a new expedition to the South Pole. In August of the same year, after less than 7 months of frantic organisation, his ship Nimrod set sail for the south. Shackleton had learned much on the Discovery expedition, but he had not learned all he should. The Nimrod departed with 10 Manchurian ponies and only 9 dogs. Even though expeditions to the Antarctic had by this time proved that dog teams were the only practical mode of polar transportation, Shackleton had also made little progress in learning how to ski, and much of his mountaineering equipment would prove inadequate. These shortcomings notwithstanding, on October 29, 1908, Shackleton departed from his base at Cape Royds over the Great Ice Barrier on his second journey south with 3 companions and a team of 4 ponies. Once again the pattern of man-hauling and suffering began. The ponies slipped and floundered, at times sinking up to their bellies in the snow. Eventually most would be shot and eaten. By early December, Shackleton and his 3 companions, Frank Wild, Dr. Eric Marshall, and Lieutenant Jameson Adams, had reached the tongue of a massive, hitherto unknown glacier that flowed from the range of mountains abutting the Great Ice Barrier. Christened by Shackleton the Beardmore Glacier, after one of the expedition's patrons, it was to be his party's gateway from the ice shelf, on which they had been travelling, to the continental plateau behind the mountains. It provided a fearful, glittering passage. Without crampons, the men, accompanied by Socks, the lone remaining and unshod pony, fought their way up the dangerous tongue of ice. On the third day, the pony fell down a crevasse to his death. Suffering from snow blindness, hunger, and frostbite, the men struggled beyond the Beardmore, onto 88 degrees 23 minutes south, approximately 100 miles short of the pole. Here Shackleton took realistic stock of their meagre provisions and failing strength, and made the bitter decision to turn back while survival was still possible. Near journey's end, with Adams critically ailing, Shackleton and Frank Wild dumped all the gear they could spare, so as to make a desperate dash for the relief of their companion. They travelled 36 hours with little rest, only to find that the base camp they had so long dreamed of was deserted. They were discovered shortly afterward when the Nimrod returned with a search party preparing to winter over and look for their bodies. Shackleton's efforts surpassed Scott's southern record by some 360 miles. Although he and his companions had suffered greatly, they survived, and thanks in great part to the fresh pony meat, had kept scurvy at bay. Back in England, Shackleton became a national hero and was knighted. Although he publicly made tentative plans for another southern expedition, this one to explore the land west of Cape Adare and the Ross Sea, his time was consumed by efforts to pay off the Nimrod's debts. For the next couple of years, Shackleton hit the lecture trail, dictated a best-selling book called The Heart of the Antarctic, and even turned the Nimrod into a museum, to which he charged admission. Meanwhile, Scott, with the prayers and good wishes of the nation, headed back for another assault on the South Pole. Shackleton, mired in financial obligations, could only read the headlines and wait. Scott's last journey is of course an epic of its own. In October 1910 the news broke that the Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen had secretly turned back from a projected trip to the Arctic and was headed south, intent on beating the British to the pole. The race was on. Both expeditions set out in October 1911, Scott from Cape Evans, near his old base, Amundsen from the Bay of Whales, some distance to the east. Scott's party bogged down by a bewildering array of modes of transportation. Ponies, such as Shackleton had already proved to be useless, motor sledges that didn't work, and dogs that no one knew how to drive, slogged their way south. Adhering closely to Shackleton's route, and playing out the now traditional drama of starvation and hardship. Amundsen and his 4 companions, travelling by ski, with a team of 52 superbly conditioned and trained dogs, averaged a comfortable 15 to 20 miles a day, in comparison with Scott's ragged 10 to 13 mile daily pace. On their homeward run, the Norwegians covered up to 30 miles a day. "Cannot understand what the English mean when they say that dogs cannot be used here," Amundsen puzzled in his diary. On January 16, 1912, Scott and his debilitated team staggered to 89 degrees south to find the snow crisscrossed with the tracks of Amundsen's party. "The worst has happened," Scott allowed in his diary. "All the daydreams must go." The following day the dispirited party continued to the pole, planted their flag, took their notes and photographs, and prepared to turn back. "Great God, this is an awful place," wrote Scott. "Now for the run home, and a desperate struggle. I wonder if we can do it." They could not. Each of the 5 men in Scott's company died on the ice. The end came in a raging blizzard that trapped the party down to 3 survivors in their single tent, a mere 11 miles south of the vital supply depot. Now Scott unfurled his real greatness, not for expeditionary leadership, but for language. "We shall die like gentlemen," he wrote to the expedition's treasurer in England. "I think this will show that the spirit of pluck and power to endure has not passed out of our race." His message to the public is a litany of excuses stirringly presented: failed pony transport, weather, snow, frightfully rough ice, a shortage of fuel in our depots for which I cannot account, the illness of his brave companion Titus Oates. Yet it is a cynical reader indeed who remains unmoved by this tide of final words, penned in the gallant little tent, and poured forth into the white night that raged around it. "Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of hardihood, endurance, and courage of my companions, which would have stirred the heart of every Englishman. These rough notes and our dead bodies must tell the tale. It seems a pity," he wrote as his diary's last entry on March 29th, "but I do not think I can write more." It took nearly a year for Scott's last words to reach the outside world. When they did, in February 1913, they plunged the entire empire into deep mourning. With the sole exception of the death of Nelson in the hour of victory, there has been nothing so dramatic, a journalist noted. Scott's tragedy was commemorated in the press and in the pulpit. In the public telling, his party's fatal, perverse blunders were not merely forgotten but evaporated out of existence. A myth was born and propagated by the eventual publication of Scott's diaries, subtly edited by Sir James Barrie, the author of Peter Pan and a master of sentimental prose. This, then, was the background against which Shackleton pulled together his Imperial Transantarctic expedition. Setting out the year after the news of Scott's death, the Endurance expedition was ambivalently perceived as both a gripping national event and an anticlimax. In the public imagination, Antarctica was very much the place for heroic adventure, yet it seemed unthinkable that any future success could surpass Scott's glorious failure. Shackleton's aims, as stated in his expedition's prospectus, were compelling. From the sentimental point of view, it is the last great polar journey that can be made. It will be a greater journey than the journey to the pole and back, and I feel it is up to the British nation to accomplish this, for we have been beaten at the conquest of the North Pole and beaten at the conquest of the South Pole. There now remains the largest and most striking of all journeys, the crossing of the continent. Shackleton eventually cobbled together funds for his grand venture. His principal backers were the British government and Sir James Key Caird, a wealthy Scottish jute manufacturer who contributed a princely gift of £24,000. Other benefactors of note were Miss Janet Stancombe Wills, daughter of a tobacco tycoon, and Dudley Docker of the Birmingham Small Arms Company. Lesser outright gifts came from the Royal Geographical Society, other individuals and public schools throughout England, who underwrote the dog sledging teams. Another source of money was the advance sale of all news and pictorial rights to the expedition. Antarctica was the first continent to be discovered by camera. Beginning with Scott's first expedition in 1902, photography had captured the slow inroads made on its white, inviolate vastness. These photographic records had proved to be not only of historic and geographic interest, but also highly popular. Herbert Ponting's 90 Degrees South, a cinematic tribute to Scott's last expedition, was still a favourite when Shackleton's party set out. Mindful of this, Shackleton formed the Imperial Transantarctic Film Syndicate, specifically to exploit all film rights to the expedition, exclusive story rights having been sold to the Daily Chronicle. Shackleton purchased a ship from Norway's famous Framnes shipyard, long a supplier of polar vessels. A 300-ton wooden barkentine, she was named Polaris and had never sailed. She was 144 feet long, built of planks of oak and Norwegian fir, up to 2.5 feet thick, and sheathed in greenheart, a wood so tough it cannot be worked by conventional means. Every detail of her construction had been scrupulously, even lovingly, planned by a master shipwright to ensure her maximum strength. She was, it seemed, ideally equipped to withstand the ice. Shackleton renamed her Endurance after his family motto, Fortitudine Vincimus, by endurance we conquer. In fact, 2 vessels were required. While Shackleton intended to commence his overland trek from the Weddell Sea, his plans called for a relief ship to sail to his old base at Cape Royds in the Ross Sea. From there, a 6-man depot-laying party would advance inland, depositing caches of supplies for the use of Shackleton's transcontinental party when it slogged its way overland from the other side. For this task, Shackleton purchased the Aurora, an old-time sealer built in 1876 that had served a former colleague, the great Australian explorer Douglas Mawson. By August, all seemed ready. Although the British press had shown keen interest in Shackleton's latest polar adventure, the departure of the Endurance from its London dock on August 1, 1914, was eclipsed by more important news. Germany had declared war on Russia, and a European war was now imminent. Having sailed from London to Plymouth, the ship was still in British waters when the order for general mobilization was given on Monday, August 4th. After consulting with his crew, Shackleton placed the Endurance and her company at the disposal of the government, believing there were enough trained and experienced men among us to man a destroyer. Privately, he must have held his breath, after so much work and planning to be thwarted at the start. But the one-word telegraphed reply from the Admiralty dissolved his fears. Proceed. A longer cable from Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, followed, saying that the authorities desired the expedition to take place, and on August 8th the Endurance set sail for Plymouth. With the example of Amundsen's triumph of efficiency vividly before him, Shackleton had taken what were, by British standards, enormous pains with his preparations. He had succeeded in having seconded to the expedition a young officer from the Royal Marines, who, although officially the motor expert, was also proficient enough on skis to act as an instructor for the company. The Illustrated London News ran a photograph of Shackleton testing his new domed tents in Norway. He had consulted with professional nutritionists regarding sledging rations, and, heeding the adamant advice of the Norwegians, arranged to have 69 Canadian sledge dogs delivered to Buenos Aires, where the Endurance would pick them up on her way south. These were, according to his second-in-command, a mixture of wolf and about any kind of big dog: collie, mastiff, Great Dane, bloodhound, Newfoundland, retriever, Airedale, boarhound, etc. Despite these efforts, his party was not as shipshape as Shackleton may have thought. He had his dogs, but his sole experienced dog trainer and driver, a Canadian, dropped out at the last minute when Shackleton was unwilling to pay a hefty insurance deposit. Also left behind were worm pills, which, as matters turned out, the dogs would desperately need. Shackleton's plans for the continental crossing called for an average of 15 miles sledging a day, very close to Amundsen's outgoing average of 16, and yet only one of Shackleton's men left England actually knowing how to ski. But the expedition had intangible assets deriving from Shackleton's previous endeavours. In 1909, having trudged to 88 degrees south, 100 miles short of the pole, he had turned his back on certain glory and led his men on the long journey home. After so many hard miles, it was excruciating to leave the unclaimed prize for another man, let alone a rival. Yet Shackleton resisted persuading himself that he could safely cover those foregone miles, or that they counted for more than life itself. Had he been less self-possessed, or more desperate for glory, undoubtedly Ernest Shackleton would have been the first man to stand at the South Pole, and he and his trusting men would have died somewhere close to where Scott and his party perished in their little tent. Shackleton's decision to turn back was more than a singular act of courage. It bespoke the dogged optimism that was the cornerstone of his character. Life would always offer more chances. One has the feeling that if it had been Shackleton who lost to Amundsen at the pole, he would have met up with the Norwegians on the way back, and they would have all held a big celebratory party, a distinguished polar historian once told me. The despondency that clearly crushed Scott on his loss to Amundsen was unknown to Shackleton. He seems to have been possessed of a ferocious but handedly adaptable single-mindedness. Once intent on achieving the pole, he strained every nerve to get there, but when survival became the challenge, he was not distracted by such demons as regret or the fear of being perceived a failure. Early in his career, Shackleton became known as a leader who put his men first. This inspired unshakable confidence in his decisions, as well as tenacious loyalty. During the march back from 88 degrees south, one of Shackleton's three companions, Frank Wild, who had not begun the expedition as a great admirer of Shackleton, recorded in his diary an incident that changed his mind forever. Following an inadequate meal of pemmican and pony meat on the night of January 31st, 1909, Shackleton had privately forced upon Wild one of his own biscuits from the 4 that he, like the others, was rationed daily. I do not suppose that anyone else in the world can thoroughly realize how much generosity and sympathy was shown by this, Wild wrote, underlining his words. I do. By God, I shall never forget it. Thousands of pounds would not have bought that one biscuit. When Shackleton headed south on the Endurance in August 1914, it was with Frank Wild as his second-in-command. Wild never forgot the private act of kindness, and his adamantine loyalty to Shackleton would prove to be one of the expedition's major assets. However deficient the preparations for the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition may have been, on one point it was secure. Its men had a leader who had shown signs of greatness. To be sure, Shackleton would fail once more to achieve his expedition's goal. In fact, he was destined never to set foot on the Antarctic continent again. Nevertheless, he would see his men through one of the greatest epics of survival in the annals of exploration. South. Leaving England on August 8, 1914, the Endurance headed south by way of Madeira, Montevideo and Buenos Aires, where it spent nearly 2 weeks loading stores while adjustments were made to the crew. Shackleton himself did not join the expedition until it reached Buenos Aires in mid-October. All had not been easy on this first leg south. Short of fuel, the Endurance had burned the wood allocated for the magnetician's Antarctic hut, and under the command of the high-spirited Captain Frank Worsley, a New Zealander, Discipline aboard ship had been markedly lax. Worsley himself mentions an altercation in Madeira, noting with some gusto, "Irving was cut with a sword on top of his head, and Barr had had a large flower pot broken in his face." Significantly, shortly after Shackleton met his ship, the names Irving and Barr, along with two others, now forgotten, disappear from the ship's roll. Also joining the Endurance in Buenos Aires, a few days before Shackleton, was James Francis Hurley, a gifted Australian photographer, and the man upon whom Shackleton's film syndicate had pinned its hopes. Hurley was born for this kind of venture. Independent and stubborn even as a boy, he ran away from home at the age of 13, finding work with the local ironworks, which in turn took him to the Sydney dockyards. While a teenager, he bought his first camera, a 15-shilling Kodak box, paid for with $1 a week. Hurley's first professional work was taking pictures for postcards, but he had quickly moved on to more congenial assignments. On October 26th, the Endurance, painted black and loaded with fresh supplies, as well as 69 Canadian sledging dogs, set sail for the South Atlantic. The company had not been particularly reassured to learn that the unusually wet weather in Buenos Aires indicated that the ice had not broken in the Weddell Sea. Nor could the state of the funding, shaky as usual, have contributed to Shackleton's peace of mind. James Wordie, the expedition's geologist, had advanced personal monies to Shackleton for the purchase of fuel, and although the ship carried a wireless receiver, the expedition could not afford to purchase a transmitting plant. Nevertheless, the Endurance was bound at last for South Georgia, east of the Falklands, her final port of call. Like most expeditions of this kind, the ship carried a mixed company of officers and scientists, as well as seamen. In Scott's expeditions, the two groups had been strictly segregated in naval fashion, but under Shackleton, less attention was paid to niceties of class. "So I find we have got to work," wrote Marine Captain Thomas Ord Lees in his diary. "The crew of the ship is insufficient for her needs as a sailing ship, and so whenever she is under sail, and a sail requires altering in any way, we, the scientists, 6 of us, have to pull on the ropes. Rope pulling makes the hands sore, and the ropes are exceedingly dirty and tarry, but it is good exercise." Lees was Shackleton's ski expert, and was also in charge of the aero-propelled motor sledges that were destined not to work. His diary, the most chatty and opinionated of those kept by expedition members, is also one of the most informative. Lees was a public school man, educated at Marlborough. No one found the menial tasks more distasteful, and yet even he could discern their purpose. "One can always have a bath afterwards, and I suppose it is good for one from a disciplinary point of view," he conceded in his diary. Just how vital this discipline would prove to the well-being of the company as a whole, not even Shackleton could have known. The Endurance arrived at South Georgia on November 5th, 11 days after leaving Buenos Aires, in a mist of snow squalls that obscured a jagged, precipitous coastline. The company was greeted warmly by the island's small population of Norwegian whalers, and were impressed by the level of amenity their hosts had managed to maintain at this most remote outpost of humanity. There were electric lights and hot water, and the home of the Grytviken station manager, Fritjof Jakobsen, was not only heated but had geraniums blooming in its bow windows. These charms, however, could not conceal the noxious presence of the whaling industry. The island's natural harbours were full of greasy offal and the stench of decaying whale carcasses, and the waters of Grytviken were red. The whalers provided the expedition with coal and clothing, bought on credit, as well as valuable information. No men on earth knew better the seas Shackleton was poised to enter, and they confirmed the reports from Buenos Aires that ice conditions were unusually severe that year, with pack extending farther north than it had in anyone's recollection. Shackleton was advised to wait until later in the austral summer, and so the brief time he had planned to spend on South Georgia turned to a full month. The month on South Georgia appears to have been passed agreeably, with the men getting to know one another and each becoming familiar with his duties. Amid the magnificent sub-Antarctic scenery and fauna, elephant seals, penguins, and other bird life, they could at last feel their adventure to the great white south was truly underway. The dog trainers took their charges to a nearby hillside, and attempted to restrain them from gorging on whale offal and rooting through the old whalers' cemetery. The scientists wandered up into the hills, looking at the abundant wildlife and securing specimens. Frank Hurley, aided by Captain Worsley and First Officer Lionel Greenstreet, lugged his 40 pounds of camera equipment to the heights overlooking the Grytviken harbour and preserved the image of the Endurance riding at anchor, rendered insignificant by the stupendous encirclement of mountains. Lees, characteristically, sought to go off and climb challenging peaks on his own. Shackleton, characteristically, forbade him. The carpenter was busy constructing a covering for the extra deck space. The sailors remained with the ship. Several members of the expedition could count themselves old Antarctic hands. Alfred Cheetham, the third officer, had been south more times than any other man on board the Endurance except Frank Wild. First in 1902 as boatswain on the Morning, the relief ship sent to search out and supply Scott's Discovery, as third officer with Shackleton on the Nimrod, and with Scott again on the Terra Nova. Born in Liverpool, Cheetham was small and wiry. Known for his cheery, willing manner, he was the shanty man on both the Nimrod and the Endurance, and an old salt to the marrow of his bones. When asked to join the Nimrod crew, so the story goes, Cheetham had immediately agreed, then hastened off to tell the wife of his mate Chippy Bilsby, carpenter on the Morning, that her husband was going to the Antarctic again. Having delivered this message, he continued to the house where Bilsby himself was working. "Hey, Chippy lad, come down," Cheetham called out in broad Liverpudlian. "Thou's bound to South Pole with me." Bilsby: "I's better see to missus first." Cheetham: "I've seen to wife, Chippy, come on." Frank Hurley, of course, had been south as well. He was 26 in 1911, when he first heard word that Douglas Mawson, Australia's noted polar explorer, was planning a journey to the Antarctic. Determined to get the job of expedition photographer, but with no contacts to recommend him, Hurley had waylaid Mawson in a private railway compartment, selling himself to the explorer for the duration of their journey. 3 days later, Hurley received word of his acceptance. Mawson had admired Hurley's initiative. The success of Hurley's eventual film about the Mawson expedition, entitled Home of the Blizzard, had partly inspired Shackleton's Imperial Trans-Antarctic Film Syndicate venture. Aboard the Endurance, Hurley was considered hard as nails, able to endure harsh conditions and willing to go to any length to obtain a desired shot. Professionally much admired, he was not universally liked. Having come up in the world by dint of talent and hard work, he was keenly conscious of his superior abilities. He was susceptible to flattery, and was considered rather bombastic. His nickname was the Prince. George Marston had been with Shackleton on the Nimrod. A graduate of a London art school, he was part of a young set that included Shackleton's two sisters, Helen and Kathleen, who encouraged him to apply for the position of expedition artist. On the Nimrod expedition, Marston took part in 3 sledging journeys, one of them with Shackleton, who had been impressed with Marston's physical abilities. The son of a coachmaker and grandson of a shipwright, Marston was, like Hurley, marvellously versatile, which would prove useful. Little is known of able seaman Thomas MacLeod, a superstitious Scotsman who had been with Scott on the Terra Nova and Shackleton on the Nimrod. Having run away to sea at the age of 14, he had 27 years of sailing experience. Tom Crean was a tall, raw-boned Irish seaman, one of 10 children born to a farming family in a remote part of County Kerry. He had come up the ranks of the Royal Navy, having enlisted at 16, adding 2 years to his age, as a boy second class in 1893. Fluent in Irish and English, Crean always regretted that his formal education had ceased at primary school. His own sensitivity to this fact, more than the fact itself, may have prevented him from rising higher than he did. On the Endurance, Crean was second officer. But in worth, if not in actual rank, Crean was, to use Shackleton's own words, trumps. He had gone south with Scott on both the Discovery and the Terra Nova expeditions, receiving the Albert Medal for bravery on the latter, and he had been among the 16 who set out with Scott for the South Pole in 1911. Scott's method was to avoid assigning roles in advance, so that no one in the crew knew whether he was destined to be in the polar party or to be turned back short of the final push, after hauling supplies for many miles. On January 3, 1912, Scott told Crean and 2 companions, Lieutenant Teddy Evans and William Lashley, that they were to turn back the next day. Although all supplies and equipment had been rationed for 2 teams of 4 men each, at the last minute Scott chose a 5th man, Birdie Bowers, to join the polar party. This decision not only contributed to the demise of his own party by adding an unexpected mouth to feed, but seriously burdened the returning trio with a 4-man sledging load. Evans, already suffering from scurvy, collapsed, and was pulled by his companions until they could go no farther. Then, 35 miles from the nearest assistance, Crean set out alone with 3 biscuits and 2 sticks of chocolate. "Well, sir, I was very weak when I reached the hut," Crean wrote in a letter to a friend. He was a hard man to rattle. Earlier in the same expedition, after an exhausting trek across fragmented sea ice with the ponies, Crean and his two companions had prepared their dinner. By mistake, a bag of curry powder was taken for cocoa. Crean, recalled his tent mate, drank his right down before discovering anything wrong. But tough though he was, Crean broke down and wept when, at 87 degrees south, only 150 miles short of their goal, Scott informed him and his companions that they had not been selected for the honour of continuing with him to the pole. A number of the sailors aboard the Endurance had formerly been trawler hands in the North Sea, as brutal an occupation as could be imagined. Little suggests they were sympathetic characters, and one of them, John Vincent, previously a sailor in the Navy and a trawler hand off the coast of Iceland, would turn out to be a problematic bully. Of the two stokers, William Stevenson was a former Royal Marine and officer's servant, and Ernest Holness, the youngest of the sailors, was a Yorkshire lad, and considered by Lees at any rate to be the most loyal to the expedition. 4 of the sailors were particularly liked. Timothy McCarthy was a young Irishman in the merchant service, known for his ebullient good humour and gift for repartee. Walter Howe, a Londoner, was only 3 weeks back home from a stint abroad when he applied for a position with the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition. Shackleton was impressed with his recent experience aboard the Canadian Auxiliary Survey ship, working only miles below the Arctic Circle off the coast of Labrador. He was also of a cheerful disposition and a good amateur artist. William Bakewell joined the expedition in Buenos Aires. He had been a farm labourer, logger, rail worker, and ranch hand in Montana before becoming a seaman at the age of 27. When his ship, the Golden Gate, ran aground in the River Plate, he and his mate Perce Blackborough wandered the docks of Buenos Aires looking for a way to England, and came upon the Endurance. It was, he said, love at first sight. On learning that she belonged to the famous polar explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton, and that he was seeking a replacement crew, the 2 young men presented themselves for consideration. Pleased with Bakewell's experience with sailing ships, as opposed to steam, Shackleton hired him. It may not have hurt his chances that Bakewell, the expedition's only American, posed as a Canadian, seeking a colonial's advantage. But Blackborough was turned away when Shackleton decided he had enough men. Aided by Bakewell and Howe, Blackborough stowed away in a clothing locker in the forecastle. The day after the ship left Buenos Aires, he was discovered and dragged before Shackleton. Hungry, frightened, and seasick, the young man was subjected to an eloquent tirade from the boss that impressed all onlooking seamen. In the end, Shackleton leaned close to Blackborough and said, "Do you know that on these expeditions we often get very hungry, and if there is a stowaway available, he is the first to be eaten?" This was correctly interpreted as official acceptance of his presence, and Blackborough was signed on as steward to help in the galley at £3 a month. In fact, Shackleton came to regard the quiet, conscientious Welshman as highly as any member of the crew. One of the oldest men was Henry McNish, known by the traditional nickname for ship carpenters as Chippy. A blunt-spoken old salt from Cathcart outside Port Glasgow, he stirred misgivings in Shackleton from the outset. "The carpenter's the only man I'm not dead certain of," Shackleton had written to his friend and agent Ernest Perris shortly before leaving South Georgia. McNish was perhaps the most mysterious member of the expedition. He claimed untruthfully to have sailed south with William Bruce's Scottish expedition in 1902, but he was in any case much travelled. For reasons that remain obscure, Shackleton and his shipmates believed him to be in his 50s, although his actual age was 40. Though not particularly liked, he was universally respected, not only as a brilliant shipwright, but also as an experienced sailor in the Royal Naval Reserve. Chips was neither sweet-tempered nor tolerant, a shipmate from another expedition recalled, and his Scots voice could rasp like frayed wire cable. McNish had brought along his cat, the irrepressible Mrs. Chippy, a tabby described as full of character by several members of the expedition, and whose chief delight was taking teasing shortcuts across the kennel roofs of the half-wild sledging dogs, whom he, for Mrs. Chippy was belatedly discovered to be a male, cannily perceived to be securely chained to their kennels. 27 in all, not including Shackleton, the men formed a relatively small team to wage the battle south through the 1,000 miles of ice-strewn ocean that lay between them and their planned destination. Each must have carefully scrutinized his fellow's experience and character, nor was Shackleton himself exempt from such assessment. "A queer bird, a man of moods, and I don't know whether I like him or not," First Officer Greenstreet wrote to his father. Shackleton had arrived in Buenos Aires somewhat under the weather, and does not seem to have been in top form while in South Georgia. Shackleton had arrived in Buenos Aires somewhat under the weather, and does not seem to have been in top form while in South Georgia. Accompanying him on a short hike, Wordy observed that he was troubled by a bad cough, and seemed pretty tired with the walk. Shackleton still had much to worry about. The worst ice conditions in living memory showed no sign of improving, and some of the whalers suggested that he should defer setting out until next season. But for Shackleton, postponement of the expedition would be tantamount to relinquishing it forever. Behind him lay the war, and many financial loose ends. The Endurance steamed out of Grytviken's Cumberland Bay on the morning of December 5, 1914. She was freshly provisioned, her cargo now included 2 live pigs for food, and her crew was rested and eager for the next stage of the journey. The mountains of South Georgia remained in sight until the evening, as the Endurance headed south by southeast. As early as the next day, the ship passed numerous icebergs, and by December 7th, she had encountered the outskirts of pack ice. The Weddell Sea is uniquely configured for maximum hazard to ships. It is contained within 3 belts of land, the string of South Sandwich Island to the east, the Antarctic continent proper, and the long finger of the Palmer Peninsula to the west. A prevailing current drives the roughly circular sea in a slow, clockwise motion. Sea ice, which can form here during any season, is thus never dispersed into the warmer northern waters, but churned in an interminable semicircle, eventually packed by the westward drift against the Palmer Peninsula. For the next 6 weeks the Endurance worked its way cautiously south, dodging and weaving around loose floes and pack, and sometimes smashing her way through them. Shackleton hoped that by keeping outside the pack's eastern edge he could obliquely work his way down towards Vassal Bay. The tactic only worked for so long, and soon he had to broach the pack. As the Endurance continued south, she entered fields of snowy ice, enormous floes up to 150 square miles. "All day we have been utilizing the ship as a battering ram," Hurley wrote in his diary in mid-December. "We admire our sturdy little ship, which seems to take a delight herself in combating our common enemy, shattering the floes in grand style. When the ship comes in impact with the ice, she stops dead, shivering from truck to kelson. Then almost immediately a long crack starts from our bows, into which we steam, and like a wedge slowly force the crack sufficiently to enable a passage to be made." Days of thick mist opened onto clear days of radiant sunshine. During the long dusk of the austral summer night, the broken pack appeared to float like so many giant white water lilies on an azure pond. The ship passed crab-eater seals basking on the ice, and crowds of always entertaining Adélie and emperor penguins, who would pop up unexpectedly on floes and clamour at her as she passed. Gradually the bodies of open water got smaller and smaller, until the whole sea looked like a vast snowfield, broken only here and there by lanes and channels. Christmas Day was celebrated with mince pies and Christmas pudding, colourful flags and table settings, and a sing-song in the evening. Magnificent sunsets were admired from the ship's rail, and on the last day of 1914, after a difficult morning spent ramming through a bad patch of ice, the Endurance crossed the Antarctic Circle in a dreamlike twilight, reflected in calm waters. On the night of January 1st, 1915, the Scottish contingent singing Auld Lang Syne woke the respectable members, who had retired for the evening. Lees peevishly noted, "Scotsmen are always a nuisance at New Year, and never have voices worth speaking of." Meanwhile, on the bridge, Wild, Worsley, and Hudson shook hands all around and wished each other a happy New Year. The weather by now was usually overcast, and the Endurance was encountering more icebergs, grand structures that rose like fantastic sculptures of blue-white marble above the waterline, and which appeared peacock blue below it. The expedition company whiled away the time in domestic pursuits. Lees darned his socks and washed and mended his clothes. Hurley took photographs in the midnight sun. Robert Clark, the biologist, studied the diatomaceous deposits of the Weddell Sea under a microscope. On January 6th, the dogs were taken off onto a convenient floe for exercise, the first they'd had since leaving South Georgia a month before. They immediately initiated one of their infamous scraps, falling through rotten ice into the water. Ice conditions on January 7th and 8th forced the ship to backtrack through the pack to seek a better opening. But on January 10th, at 72 degrees south, an important landmark was reached. The ship came in sight of Coates Land and began to work her way close to its great 100-foot-high wall of barrier ice. The Endurance was now, with fair going, as little as a week away from Vassal Bay. With the expectation that she would still return to Buenos Aires or South Georgia for the winter, the expedition's wintering over shore party were busy writing letters home to be carried with the returning ship. On January 11th, the ship's company began the day with a breakfast of Quaker oats, seal's liver and bacon. Bad weather forced the Endurance to drift with a large floe. McNish, the carpenter, used this layover to make a small chest of drawers for the boss. Shackleton himself was observed to be looking dead tired. He had not slept much over the past few days. The 2 pigs, obtained in South Georgia, named Sir Patrick and Bridget Dennis, were fattening up, and one of the dogs, Sally, had given birth to 3 pups. Tough Tom Crean was observed with amusement to be fussing over the pups, like a hospital orderly. The day closed with a dinner of thick lentil soup, stewed clubbed seal, tinned peas, and custard. January 12th dawned with mist and snow, but was otherwise a good day. Clark bagged interesting specimens in his dredge nets, and towards evening a flock of young emperor penguins was passed on a nearby floe. The Endurance, now under steam, broke from the pack ice into open water and reached the bay that marked the farthest south of William Bruce's Scotia expedition of 1903. Shallow soundings of about 150 fathoms indicated the proximity of land. Lees, busy among the stores, triumphantly routed out a case of marmalade and 1 or 2 other things that Sir Ernest especially wanted. On January 13th, after skirting heavy pack around the barrier all night, the Endurance was again drifting within the floes, which showed no sign of opening up. For 2 hours she searched for an opening, then banked her fires and lay to. The following day, January 14th, the ship was still held fast. The weather was magnificent, however, the best since leaving South Georgia, with the temperature at 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Hurley, ever on the lookout for photogenic scenes, described the surroundings thus: "The bergs and floes were reflected in the deep blue, while the heavy-pressure ice, gleaming in the sunshine with its deep blue shadows, was one of the finest sights I have seen in the south. The ice was more like seracs than pack ice, for it was so tossed, broken, and crushed. Great pressure ridges thrown up 15 to 20 feet in height bear evidence of the terrific force and pressure of the ice in these latitudes." From the crow's nest high above the ship, Lees noted that tremendous pressure pack could be seen in every direction. Yet in the evening, a rising breeze began to work upon the pack, and before midnight a lane of open water had appeared at the foot of the barrier. In the early morning of January 15th, the Endurance continued under hazy skies. An unusually large number of seals were seen throughout the day, and at 3 in the afternoon the ship passed a large group, swimming out from the barrier to offshore pack. The whole company gathered at the rail to watch and exclaim as the seals dove and played around the ship like porpoises. It was an event that everyone remembered with affection. By evening the skies were clear and a lane of water had opened to allow the Endurance to speed south under sail. Fine, clear water lay ahead. Just after midnight, in the strange, perpetual summer twilight, the ship came upon a sheltered bay, formed by the projecting end of a great glacier and the ice barrier. "The bay would have made an excellent landing place," Shackleton wrote, noting its natural key of flat ice, and its unusual configuration, which sheltered it from all but northerly winds. "I named the place Glacier Bay," he continued, and had reason later to remember it with regret. The Endurance steamed along the glacier front through the night, and by early morning had arrived at another glacial overflow, deeply crevassed, its frozen torrent spilling over a cliff face that rose as high as 350 feet. At 8:30 a.m., the ship's splendid run of 124 miles was brought to a halt by dense pack ice, partly held in place, as Shackleton surmised, by the strikingly large bergs in the vicinity. The ship drew up close to a small berg, distinguished by well-defined bands of embedded matter, which expedition geologist James Wordie identified as biotite granite. Later in the day an easterly wind blew up, eventually increasing to gale force. While the leeward pack began to break and disperse under its pressure, the Endurance lay to behind a convenient berg. It was tedious to be held up after such a satisfying run. Lees, for one, whiled away the time with a characteristic tidying up of stores in the hold. The gale continued throughout the following day. The Endurance, unanchored, pitched about on the rough sea, steaming around and around in small circles all the while. A few seals rode the waves past her, their heads high above the water. From his bunk, Hurley looked up from his book to glance at the huge white bergs and lowering clouds through a porthole window. On January 18th, the gale had abated sufficiently to allow the Endurance to raise sail in the morning and take advantage of a long lead that had opened at the foot of the glacier front. Pack ice was encountered, however, in the afternoon. Cautiously, the Endurance was nosed through the thick brash into open water, where she enjoyed a 24-mile run before heading into more heavy brash and large, loose floes. The character of the pack has again changed, Worsley noted. The floes are very thick, but are composed of a greater proportion of snow. Though they are broken up slightly into large floes, the brash between is so thick and heavy that we cannot push through, except with a very great expenditure of power. We therefore prefer to lie to for a while, to see if the pack opens up at all when this northeast wind clears. Fighting seasickness brought on by the rough sea, Lees had endured his turn at the wheel, where it was snowing and blowing and generally horrid. In the afternoon he spent his spare time readying the stores for landing, sorting them into ship and shore piles. Less industrious members of the expedition were bored by the delay. It is gratifying to feel we are only 80 miles from our intended base, Vassal Bay, Hurley wrote, referring to it by its German name. We are all keen to reach it, as the monotony is telling on some of us. The weather on the following morning was good, but the ice conditions had worsened, the pack having closed in around the ship during the night. The scientists dutifully took specimens, but everyone's attention was on the ice. The gale had packed it so tightly against the continental shelf that no water at all could now be sighted from the crow's nest. Still, the ship's company turned in that night, hoping that a change in the wind would open the pack and allow them to continue on their way. The Endurance was now as little as one good day's sail away from Vassal Bay. The northeasterly gale, that had been blowing intermittently since January 16th, rose again in the course of the night. The day broke dull and snowy, revealing the pack pressed around the ship more densely than before. Still, the temperature was mild, 28 degrees Fahrenheit, so, as Lees noted, there is no fear at present our getting frozen in. With nowhere to go, there was not much to do. The day's excitement came when Frank Wilde shot a 9-foot crab-eater seal, providing fresh meat for the men and dogs and Mrs. Chippy. The scientists held a sing-song in Clark's cabin, a favourite gathering place as it was close to the boilers. Hurley continued writing letters to be taken with the ship when she returned to South Georgia Island, and Lees busied himself with washing and mending his wardrobe. The gale was still blowing from the northeast on January 21st, drifting snow from the continental ice shelf. Consequently, the air was full of moisture, and the wardroom and cabins became damp with condensation. Ice pressure against the rudder caused grave concern, and the crew went over the side to chip it clear. Although it represented a costly expenditure of fuel, Shackleton kept steam up in the boilers so that the ship could take advantage of the least opening in the pack. Held fast in the ice, the Endurance was being carried with the rest of the pack by the Weddell Sea's current. Soon she would be moving away from land. After 6 days of blowing on and off, the northeasterly gale subsided on January 22nd, and the following day dawned sunny and calm. Hurley immediately took advantage of the light to take some colour photographs, and Lees continued his scrubbing and darning. An assessment of the ship's supply of fuel determined that only 75 tons of coal remained of the 160 the Endurance had carried from South Georgia. At midnight on January 24th, a rent in the surrounding ice opened a lead at right angles to the ship, but 100 yards distant. Full steam and sail were raised, but the Endurance could not ram through, and the ship's company took to the ice with chisels and crowbars to try to hack a path to the tantalizing lane to freedom. Although the ice could be seen breaking up some distance ahead, around the ship herself they could do nothing. Held up in the ice, nothing of any movement takes place. Still fast, and no signs of any opening. The lead that promised so much has almost closed up again. Still fast. Thus, in this anticlimactic way, do the diary entries over the next few days indicate the men's dawning awareness that the decision to lay to in the pack, made it seems in retrospect almost casually on the night of January 18th, had proved fatal to their plans. It appears as though we have stuck fast for this season, Hurley wrote at the close of January 27th. A noticeable drop in the temperature at midnight, +9 being recorded. This had the effect of freezing up many of the small pools and cementing together the floes, an ominous happening. Daily depth sounding indicated that the ship was drifting farther and farther away from land. With the regular routine winding down and less work for everyone to do, boredom inevitably set in. Games of football on the ice and attention to the dogs provided some diversion. In the wardroom, the scientists amused one another by reading aloud in the evening, and Sunday sing-songs were a regular event. Saturday nights, the traditional toast was drunk, to our sweethearts and wives, followed unfailingly by the chorus May They Never Meet. A ritual overdone by McNish one night, resulting in a quarrelsome disturbance in the forecastle. Although scientists and sailors had been prepared to travel south together, they had not counted on sharing one another's company for a polar winter, and while the possibility of the ship's wintering over had been discussed in Buenos Aires, the original plan had called for her to return to safe haven after depositing the shore party and their supplies. The idea of spending the winter on an icebound ship is extremely unpleasant, Early wrote in early February, more so owing to the necessarily cramping of the work and the forced association with the ship's party, who, although being an amiable crowd, are not altogether partial to the scientific staff. False hopes arose several times with the appearance of a lane or a change in the ice, and more than once the men set out to cut or shake the ship free. On February 22nd, the drift of the Endurance carried her to the 77th parallel. It would be the farthest south attained by the Imperial Transantarctic Expedition. The summer had gone, Shackleton wrote. Indeed, the summer had scarcely been with us at all. The seals were disappearing and the birds were leaving us. The land showed still in fair weather on the distant horizon, but it was beyond our reach now. On February 24th, Shackleton ordered the cessation of ship routine, and the Endurance officially became a winter station. Having battled valiantly through 1,000 miles of pack ice in 6 weeks, the Endurance had come within a single day's journey of her landing base. Now, exhausted by futile attempts to cut their ship free, Shackleton and his men could only watch helplessly as the Endurance drift carried them out of sight of land. The fatal turn of events affected no one more than Shackleton. Not only was he burdened with the responsibility of keeping his diverse company in good health and spirits throughout a polar winter, but he had to swallow bitter personal disappointment. He was 40 years old, and the Endurance expedition had taken formidable energy to assemble. With a war underway at home, it was unlikely that he would have another opportunity of returning to the south any time soon. This was his last shot. Although for some while it remained theoretically possible that the expedition could proceed in the spring, when the breakup of the pack would release his ship, Shackleton was realistic enough to know that every passing day made this increasingly impossible. It was more than tantalizing, it was maddening, wrote Alexander Macklin, one of the ship's 2 surgeons, in his diary. Shackleton at this time showed one of his sparks of real greatness. He did not rage at all, or show outwardly the slightest sign of disappointment. He told us simply and calmly that we must winter in the pack, explained its dangers and possibilities, never lost his optimism, and prepared for winter. Meanwhile, Hubert Hudson, the navigator, repeatedly tried the ship's wireless to get signals from the Falklands, the nearest transmitting station, but without success. The expedition was not only out of sight of land, no one in the world knew where it was. The Breakup. March opened to a blizzard and a temperature of -8 degrees Fahrenheit. The floes around the ship had become so rough from the wind working upon them that crew members smashed 2 sledges trying to haul seal meat over the broken surface. Towards the end of this same day, Worsley gave orders for all hands to stay on board. The snow had become so heavy that it was dangerous to stray outside. When the weather cleared, the creaking of ice and the sounds of the wind in all its moods filled the silence. At night, the men were kept awake by the light glinting upon the floes throughout the long austral twilight. Realistically, one could not expect the breakup of the ice until spring, sometime in October, some 7 months away. According to Shackleton's original plan, the shore party, composed of scientists and sledgers, would have been busy working at their various duties, preparing for the journeys they would be undertaking come spring. Those who were to have remained with the ship would have been working their passage back to a winter haven. But now, the jobs the men had come to do could not be done, and the danger of a numbing tedium hung over them. From his own experience, Shackleton well knew the peculiar psychological strain of the eerie silence and black emptiness of the impending Antarctic winter. To guard against this, he set a strict winter routine. Instead of the usual rotation of sea watches, a single watchman was on duty from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., allowing all other hands to enjoy uninterrupted sleep. To boost morale as much as stave off the cold, Shackleton issued to all hands the winter clothing originally designated for the shore parties. each article of which Lees had assiduously catalogued in his diary. 2 Jaeger wool shirts and combinations, or long underwear, Shetland wool mitts, 1 Shetland wool jersey, and, most important, Burberry tunics and trousers. These last were, in the words of one expedition member, roughly the weight of umbrella fabric or calico, but supposedly so tightly woven as to be impervious to wind. A number of the sailors immediately stowed the new clothing safely away in their lockers, so as to have it for swank when they returned to civilization. Only clothing meant for the transcontinental party was kept apart, in the belief or pretext that the crossing might still happen. Shackleton's immediate concern was to establish comfortable winter quarters for his men. March temperatures were running from plus 11 degrees to minus 24 degrees, and the deckhouse cabins, where the afterguard of scientists and ship officers lived, were bitterly cold. Shackleton ordered the storage area between decks cleared, and Chippy McNish began the work of constructing cubicles within this more insulated area. On March 11th, the men moved down to their new quarters, which they had christened the Ritz. Each of the roughly 6 by 5 foot cubicles housed 2 men, and each received a wry name from its occupants, such as the Billabong, the Anchorage, the Sailor's Rest. In the middle of the space was a long table where all meals were taken, and a bogey stove stood at one end. The Ritz was not only warm, its close quarters seemed familial and cosy. Crean, Wild, Marston, and Worsley moved into the old wardroom, while the sailors remained in the forecastle, which was situated between decks, and so sufficiently insulated. Shackleton also stayed where he was, alone in the captain's cabin aft. It was the coldest part of the ship. Winter accommodations for the non-human members were also affected. The dogs were housed on ice-block kennels, dubbed dogloos, in an extended circle around the ship. The pigs were disembarked to similar winter quarters, which the sailors called pigloos. Mrs. Chippy stayed on board the ship. The nights lengthened, and by the end of March there were equal hours of light and darkness. The 50-odd dogs, big, energetic, wild, and playful, became the objects of intense interest and amusement. Their care occupied several hours a day, while their antics and different personalities kept the men on their toes. The animals took well to the ice, sleeping through blizzards with equanimity, curled in furry balls under the snow. When they think there is a danger of their being overlooked by their human pals, wrote Worsley, they sit up, shake themselves, do a song and dance, and then coil down again for another snooze till grub. All our dogs spell it that way. In early April, Shackleton divided the dogs into 6 teams assigned to specific minders, each of whom came to regard his charges with intense proprietary pride. Rivalries and races between the teams now provided further entertainment. My team is one of the best, Hurley characteristically confided to his diary. The dogs' health was a matter of constant concern. A number had already died, the victims of intestinal worms. April was also a tragic month for the pigs, whom the seamen converted into pork. In the dwindling light, the men exercised the dog teams, or scouted for now infrequent seals, or went off on exploratory hikes across the ice. Like the hapless Endurance, a number of icebergs had also become trapped in the pack, and so ship and landscape drifted in tandem, held together by the northwest current. As familiar objects in the men's erratically shifting world, many of these companion icebergs came to be regarded with affection. Notable among these was the aptly named Rampart Berg, which they had first encountered in early January, while still under sail. Some 150 feet in height, it now reared majestically above the ice 20 miles from the ship. In the evenings there were sing-songs for entertainment, led by Leonard Hussey, the popular meteorologist, who was also a proficient banjo player. Occasionally Hurley presented Langton slide lectures, showing scenes of ice and snow from his Mawson expedition, or of sun and vegetation from his trip to Java. After most of the company turned in to bed, the lone night watchman was often joined by his pals, sharing such treats as cocoa and sardines on toast. These night visitors were called ghosts. On the 1st of May, the sun disappeared entirely, not to be seen for the next 4 months. The men's activities were now curtailed even more. Exercise of the dogs continued, despite the difficulty in navigating the sledges over broken ice in the uncertain light, but excursions far from the ship were discouraged. Diversions of all kinds were sought. Hurley and Hussey became keen chess opponents, welcoming the mental stimulation of the game. In the forecastle, the sailors played cards and draughts. Books were read and argumentatively analysed, and for a time guessing games were all the rage in the Ritz. In late May, the men succumbed to winter madness, shaving their heads and posing amid great hilarity while Hurley immortalized the moment with a photograph. Yet, even in these winter months, there were days and nights of intense magical beauty that raised morale and reminded some of the men why they had ventured into this harsh world. The strange mingling of faint daylight and a radiant moon on the frozen sea rendered the landscape mystically luminous. In the pure dark of a clear night, the stars glittered with unimagined brilliance, while faint aurora tinged the horizon. Coming back from a sledging ride one night, Hurley described with elation the sensation of driving into the face of the moon. The diaries of the men reflect to varying degrees a generally contented company. There are notes of peevishness and signs of the strain of living at close quarters with the same faces day after day, but no friction of real consequence. We all manage to live very happily here on board in spite of conflicting interests, and the fact that most members are what one might term rather definite personalities, and of somewhat different stations in life, wrote Lees, ever mindful of class distinctions. Yet he continues, there is no real need to have quarrels of any kind with one's comrades. Amongst gentlemen, quarrels should be and can be avoided, and there is no reason, therefore, why that should not be the case down here. This was a particularly generous statement, written as it was only a short time after Hussey and Hurley had emptied a handful of lentils into his open mouth while he slept, to stop him snoring. The general peace that prevailed on the Endurance had not come about by accident, and owed something to the manner in which Shackleton had selected the men in the first place. When James presented himself for his interview, the great explorer had bewildered him by asking not about his suitability for a major polar expedition or details of his scientific work, but whether he could sing. "Oh, I don't mean any Caruso stuff," Shackleton had continued, "but I suppose you can shout a bit with the boys." The question proved to be uncannily appropriate. What he was looking for was an attitude, not paper qualifications. Shackleton's presence informed every event that occurred on his ship. On the one hand, he was always ready to be one of the boys. He shaved his head along with everyone else, and he joined enthusiastically and tunelessly in the sing-songs. He was anxious, with much to ponder and plan, but he did not require a brooding solitude in which to do this. He was always among his men, perceived to be in good spirits, and this fact alone was in great part responsible for the atmosphere of security that pervaded their stricken circumstances. Shackleton did not believe in unnecessary discipline, and yet, ultimately, nothing happened without his consent. He was known to be above all fair, and so commands were obeyed not only because they were commands, but because they were generally perceived as being reasonable. His attention to the crew in the forecastle was scrupulous. This was illustrated very clearly when the winter clothing was distributed. The forecastle hands were supplied first, before officers and the shore party. Whoever goes short, it is not the crew, Worsley wrote. Walter Howe and William Bakewell, both lowly able seamen but avid readers, could look forward to discussing the books they had read in the excellent ship's library one-on-one with Sir Ernest Shackleton. Blackborrow, the stowaway, was made to attend to his schooling, Sir Ernest having taken a personal interest in the bright, conscientious young man. Yet, when occasion required, Shackleton's commanding personality could also confront the most difficult individuals head-on. John Vincent, the boatswain, a swaggering trawler hand who was physically bigger and stronger than any of the rest of the crew, was a bully. When a delegation from the forecastle complained to Shackleton of ill treatment at his hands, the boss summoned Vincent to his cabin. Vincent left shaken and demoted, and caused no more specific trouble. Shackleton had not felt the need for backup in this encounter, which in the hands of lesser men could have turned into an unpleasantly jittery affair. He could put on a disdainful look that made you shrivel up, according to First Officer Lionel Greenstreet. He could be very cutting when he wanted to, but I think it was more the look. Above all else, Shackleton judged a man by the degree of optimism he projected. Optimism, Shackleton once said, is true moral courage. Those not blessed with this gift he regarded with transparent contempt. This was the case with poor Lees, who was probably the most universally unpopular member of the expedition on account of his snobbishness and his inclination to be absent when hard work was demanded. For Shackleton, however, these flaws mattered less than Lee's naked anxiety about supplies and provisions. Lees had been appointed storekeeper and was in charge of rationing and keeping tally of what was consumed, but his able fulfillment of these duties was marred by his tendency to hoard and secrete away trivial odds and ends for his own personal use. This to Shackleton suggested morbid pessimism, a lack of faith in availability of future stores, and so, despite Lee's own reverence for Shackleton as a leader, he was despised. Characteristically, however, Shackleton was not vindictive. When later in the winter Lees was laid up with a bad back, after shovelling snow, the first work he has done since we left London, Macnish sourly observed, Shackleton placed him in his own cabin, checking in on him from time to time and bringing him cups of tea. At first, wrote Lees plaintively, I was in my own bunk, lying in indifference and almost complete darkness all day. These are the words of a lonely man. One has the distinct feeling that Shackleton sensed some less observable malaise behind Lee's symptoms, and that he whisked Lee away from self-pity and the needling of his sceptical shipmates for a little ego-boosting, all for a man he actively disliked. Another pillar of the high morale on board Endurance was Frank Wild, Shackleton's second-in-command. No man had a bad word to say about him. He has, wrote Lees, rare tact, and the happy knack of saying nothing and yet getting people to do things just as he requires them. If he has any orders to give us, he gives them in the nicest way. Wild was 40, the same age as Shackleton. He was born in Yorkshire, the son of a schoolteacher, and claimed, untruly, that he was a direct descendant of the great Captain Cook. Before his first journey south on the Discovery, Wild had served in both the merchant service and the navy. He later declined Scott's invitation to join the Terra Nova expedition, casting his lot instead with Mawson's Australasian Antarctic expedition. Wild had a laid-back competence, an unassuming manner, and it was to him that most petty complaints were made. That Clark, the biologist, wasn't polite enough, that Marston was a bully. To each grievance, Wild appeared to give complete attention and understanding, with the result that the petitioner left feeling vindicated, even if no action was actually taken. Wild's loyalty to Shackleton was bone-marrow deep, and together the two men made a formidably efficient team. Despite the efforts to generate amusements, time hung very heavily for the scientists. James Jock Wordie, the geologist, and Reginald Jimmy James, the magnetician and physicist, had been friends at Cambridge. Jimmy James, earnest and reserved, was the stereotypical academic, brilliant and engaged in his field, somewhat baffled and inept in everything outside of it. The son of a London umbrella maker, James had led a sheltered academic life. He had given up a desirable university appointment to come south. His ice-block physics lab was called a Fizzaloo by the sailors. James was a good conversationalist, talking excitedly about such issues as vaporization, pressure of gases, and atmospheric phenomena, often baited by Greenstreet and Hudson, whose facetious questions would eventually silence him. Unexpectedly, he proved to be one of the best actors in the farcical skits that were a mainstay of ship entertainment. Wordie was from Glasgow, and a popular member of the expedition. His dry humour and unmalicious leg-pulling were much appreciated. He had determined to join the expedition while at Cambridge, despite having attended a dinner there with Lady Scott, Captain Robert Scott's colourful widow, who tried to dissuade all would-be candidates from the thought of going with Shackleton. But Wordie suspected that this would be the last big expedition which would go south. Unable to do much in the way of geology, he had turned his attention to glaciology. Robert Clark, the biologist, was a dour man of very few words. Even in Hurley's photographs, his reserve and self-containment are unmistakable. He won respect from all hands, being hard-working and strong, and could be counted on to volunteer for disagreeable jobs, such as shoveling coal. He was also an excellent football player. Almost from the moment he left England, he was at work with his dredging nets, and grimly continued with his scientific duties while in the ice. He was forever skinning and dissecting penguins, a practice that gave rise to the rumour among the sailors that the scientists were looking for gold in the animals' stomachs. Leonard Hussey, the meteorologist, was a Londoner by birth, and his shipmates amused themselves by teasing him for being a Cockney. Having taken his degree from London University, he worked in the Sudan as an archaeologist before joining the Endurance. Shackleton claimed to have chosen him because the improbability of a man travelling from the heart of Africa to Antarctica amused him. Hussey's dedication to science was perhaps not as strong as that of his companions. The vagaries of the climate quite bewilder Hussey, Lees observed, for just when he thinks it is going to be one thing, the precise opposite happens. The two surgeons on board, Alexander Macklin and James McElroy, were kept busy with the dogs. Both had been appointed as sledging team drivers, and it was their lot to attend to the parasite-ridden animals. Macklin was a Scot, the son of a physician from the Scilly Isles. Much of his boyhood had been spent around the islands in small boats. Although he could be quick-tempered, he was generally soft-spoken and very hard-working. He was also considered one of the group's best rugby players. McElroy was about 35 years old, handsome and sardonic, already a man of the world who had practiced for years in Egypt, Malaya and Japan, and as ship's doctor on East Indian passenger steamers. He was from Northern Ireland. A third of the expedition were Scotch and Irish, and his humour could be wicked. One of his most successful performances, as recorded by Lees himself, was an imitation of Lees' excessive deference to Shackleton. McElroy, dancing about in a most effusive way. "Yes, sir. Oh, yes, certainly, sir. Sardines, sir. Yes, sir, here they are." Dashes to pantry and back. "And bread, sir? Oh, yes, sir. Bread, sir. You shall have the night watchman's bread, sir." Another dash to the pantry, and much grovelling effusion, and so on. "And may I black your boots, sir?" In the forecastle, the sailors spend a great deal of their time in their beds. They just sleep the time away as best they can, and never seem to look for any occupation, Lees wrote disapprovingly. The sailors were exempt from night watch duties, and although they had to tend to their own quarters, they were not called upon to help out in the Ritz. Again, Shackleton's care was to ensure that no one in the lower deck had cause to feel aggrieved. There were hints that they could be troublesome, principally on the issue of meals, though seal and penguin meat were routinely served in the wardroom. Grumbling resistance to this had risen in the forecastle on the grounds that serving seal, as opposed to costly tinned meat, was a cheap way of running the expedition, but their prejudices were catered to only so far. The word came down from the forecastle one afternoon that one of the sailors had not found the day's menu of Heinz spaghetti and tomato to his taste. Shackleton sent word back that he himself had been brought up to eat what was put in front of him. Lewis Rickinson and Alfred Kerr, the two engineers, were both so quiet and unassuming that their shipmates knew little about either of them, although both were admired for their efficiency and tidiness. Rickinson, who was in his 30s, was distinguished for his experience in internal combustion engines and for being particularly sensitive to the cold. Kerr, who was a little over 20, had worked on large oil-tank steamers. Possibly no one had less to do than the three men responsible for moving the Endurance forward. Frank Worsley, the captain, was now for all intents and purposes a man without a ship. Worsley was from an educated family of settlers who had come to New Zealand from England. His father had attended rugby. He had grown up living the rugged outdoor life of a pioneer, and at 16 had followed his brother to sea as an apprentice on a wool clipper. After coming up through the ranks of the merchant service, he eventually moved to England and joined the Royal Naval Reserve. Rambunctious and erratic, he was much like some of the high-spirited sledging dogs. One of the reasons Shackleton had reconsidered his plan to return the Endurance to safe haven over the winter was that he did not completely trust Worsley to deliver her safely the following season without supervision. Few men so thoroughly enjoyed all aspects of the expedition in all its extremes as Frank Worsley. He was fond of claiming that his cabin was too stuffy, and slept instead in the 0-degree passageway. He relished shocking his shipmates by taking snow baths on the ice. His diaries are anecdotal, with a keen eye for situational comedy and for the beauty of the landscape around him. Like Shackleton, he was romantic, dreamily in search of buried treasure, of improbable journeys. Yet for all Worsley's impracticalities, he was an expertly skilled sailor. Before moving to England, he served for several years in the New Zealand government steamer service, a time spent mostly in the Pacific, where he learned to sail small boats in heavy surf. Lionel Greenstreet, a young officer in the merchant service between commissions, had signed on to the Endurance at short notice, 24 hours before the ship sailed from Plymouth, when the original first officer withdrew to join the war effort. His father was a respected captain in the New Zealand Shipping Company. Perceptive, critical, and a hard worker, he chose as companions the taciturn Clark and the rather superior Frank Hurley. Hubert Hudson, the navigator, was the son of a minister, and had grown up in an educated family, but in a tough East End neighbourhood. He had left a school sponsored by the Worshipful Company of Carpenters at age 14 to be apprenticed at Trinity House. He was a mate in the merchant service, but was studying hard for his master rank while on the Endurance. He was regarded by his shipmates as extraordinarily good-hearted and unselfish, although at times a bit touched. "One never quite knows," wrote Lees, "whether he is on the brink of a mental breakdown or bubbling over with suppressed intellectuality." He earned the nickname Buddha after appearing in a bedsheet with a kettle lid tied to his head at a small costume party held early in the expedition on board the ship. He was also the most proficient catcher of penguins for the ship larder. A handful of men kept busy despite the expedition's setback. Charles Green, the cook, and Blackborough, the steward, worked hard in the galley from early morning until night preparing meals for 28 men. Green was the son of a master chef, and had run away to sea at the age of 21, becoming a cook in the merchant navy. When war broke out, he joined a Royal Mail Line passenger liner, which docked in Buenos Aires around the time Shackleton was cleaning house. Hearing that the Endurance cook had been sacked, Green applied for the job. He had in fact met Worsley once before in Sardinia. Blackborough, the eldest of 9 children, grew up in Newport, Wales, near the town's active docks, in a seafaring family. A hint of temper, the capability of plainly speaking his mind, was perceived to lurk beneath his pleasant, easy-going manner. At only 20, he was the youngest member of the crew. Chippy McNish was also rarely idle. He was not merely a carpenter, but a master craftsman and shipwright, and was constantly building or adapting things: card tables, chests of drawers, dog kennels, decking. All the work he did was first class, according to his shipmate Macklin. He was never seen to take measurements. He simply looked at his job, then went away and cut the pieces, which always fit perfectly. Even Lees, who loathed him, recognized that McNish was an expert wooden ship's man. Although neither an officer nor a scientist, McNish was officially one of the afterguard, and his quarters were therefore not in the forecastle, but in the wardroom, now relocated to the Ritz. For the fastidious Lees, eating at the same table with so unrefined a person was a kind of penance. At scooping up peas with a knife, he is a perfect juggler. Lees would have been taken aback to learn McNish's views of the propriety of the shore party, of which he, Lees, was a member. "I've been shipmates with all sorts of men," McNish confided to his diary, "both in sail and steam, but never nothing like some of our shore party, as the most filthy language is used as terms of endearment, and worse than all is tolerated." This from an old salt whose blunt-spoken manner intimidated nearly everyone else. Between McNish and Worsley there was likewise little love lost, McNish holding a very low and undisguised opinion of Worsley's high jinks and erratic ways. Not one of the expedition company could have guessed, in these early months of the winter of 1915, that the lives of the company would eventually depend upon the skills of these 2 men, the rambunctious captain and the gruff, uncouth Chippy McNish. Finally, Frank Hurley's work remained unaffected by the change in plans. An able handyman, he kept continually busy with self-imposed tasks, such as creating an efficient thaw box for frozen seal meat, or carving signs for the various Ritz cubicles. His stint as an electrician in a Sydney post office enabled him to run the Endurance's little electric plant. But above all, he was occupied with his photography. Hurley's images, from the earliest days of the expedition when the Endurance first entered the pack ice, are marvellous, bold, abstract patterns, shaped by the play of ship's mast against ice, or the cross formed by mast and yardarm against a lead of open water. They reflect what must have been the heady sensation of having the whole of Antarctica as a bare, white canvas, to be etched by the stark, clean lines of the Endurance and her shadow. "H is marvellous," Worsley wrote toward the end of January. "With cheerful Australian profanity, he perambulates alone aloft and everywhere in the most dangerous and slippery places he can find, content and happy at all times, but cursing so if he can get a good or novel picture. Stands bare and hair waving in the wind where we are gloved and helmeted. He snaps his snaps or winds his handle, turning out curses of delight and pictures of life by the fathom." Once the Endurance became trapped, Hurley turned his camera to both the domestic life of the ship and to the vision of it improbably suspended in the protean world of the ice. On duty at all hours of the day or night, sometimes arising at midnight to take photographs, he was keenly sensitive to the variegated and ever-changing play of light, continually elated at this spectacle of sky and ice and shadows. The cold temperatures increased the difficulty of every aspect of his work. To guard against the condensation that developed on his cameras when they were carried from the outside into the ship's warmer interior, Hurley made a storage cupboard on deck, where they could be kept at a fairly constant temperature. Nevertheless, he wrote, "My apparatus needs attention every occasion it is taken out, lubricating with petroleum, etc., especially the cine, the film becoming extremely brittle." The processing, too, was conducted under less than ideal conditions. Darkroom work, rendered extremely difficult by the low temperatures, it being -13 outside, he wrote towards the end of the winter. The darkroom, situated abaft the engine room, is raised to above freezing point by a primus stove. Washing plates is troublesome, as the tank must be kept warm, or the plates become an enclosure in an ice block. After several changes of water, I placed them in a rack in Sir E's cabin, which is generally at an equable temperature. The dry plates are all spotted and carefully indexed. Development is a source of annoyance to the fingers, which split and crack around the nails in a painful manner. Elsewhere he dryly notes, difficulty in obtaining sufficient water for washing operations. All water, of course, had to be melted from blocks of ice. April, in Shackleton's words, was not uneventful. Twice that month, the ice groaned around the ship, nipping her sides and causing the Endurance to vibrate slightly. It was the first palpable hint of the pack's deadly potential.